The city was alive, buzzing with endless energy, as the lights of skyscrapers shimmered against the night sky. Amani Carter stood at the window of her modest apartment, looking out over the sprawling cityscape. Despite being the daughter of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country, tonight, she was just another young woman chasing a dream. Her family had always encouraged her to take the easy road. Her father, James Carter, owned one of the largest luxury restaurant chains in the United States. She could have walked into any of them and been handed a managerial role. But Amani craved something else, something real. She wanted to understand the world her father's employees lived in, to know their struggles, their victories, and the relentless grind of working in a kitchen. And so, she had made her choice. She applied anonymously to Le Fleur, one of her father's finest establishments, known for its exquisite cuisine and grueling work culture. The restaurant was the pinnacle of high-class dining, a place where Michelin stars were born. Amani wanted to start at the very bottom, to learn what it took to make it in the culinary world. Her first day was a whirlwind. The kitchen at Le Fleur was nothing like she imagined. The air was thick with the smell of butter, garlic, and freshly baked bread. Knives flashed, pans hissed, and the chefs moved like a well-rehearsed ballet. But there was an edge to the atmosphere, an unspoken tension that clung to the walls. The head chef, Roland Pierce, strode into the kitchen like a king surveying his kingdom. He was tall, with sharp blue eyes and an intimidating presence. His reputation preceded him, a culinary genius with an ego to match. But there was another side to him, one that revealed itself within hours of Amani's arrival. "Hey, newbie," Chef Roland barked across the room. "Don't just stand there gawking. Get to work." Amani nodded, keeping her head low, and hurried to her assigned station. She was tasked with chopping vegetables for the evening service. It was simple work, but it gave her a front-row seat to the intensity of a professional kitchen. At first, Roland's criticism seemed like typical head chef behavior, shouting orders, demanding perfection. But as the days turned into weeks, Amani began to notice a pattern. His harshest words were reserved for her, his insults laced with a bitterness that made her skin crawl. "You call that a brunoise? My grandmother could dice better than that," he sneered one evening. She swallowed her pride and focused on her work, refusing to let his words break her. Not everyone in the kitchen shared Roland's disdain. A few of her co-workers, particularly Maria, the pastry chef, and Luis, a line cook, went out of their way to help her. Maria, a warm, motherly figure, often slipped her a plate of desserts during their short breaks. And Luis taught her tricks to speed up her prep work. "You're doing fine, Amani," Luis said one night as they cleaned up after service. Roland, don't take it personally." But it was personal. Amani could feel it in the way Roland's eyes narrowed every time she made even the smallest mistake. The turning point came one hectic Friday night. The restaurant was fully booked, and the kitchen was in chaos. Amani had been tasked with preparing a delicate sauce, a task she had performed flawlessly dozens of times before. But in the rush, she accidentally added a pinch too much salt. Roland exploded. "You incompetent fool," he roared, grabbing the pan and throwing it into the sink. The clang echoed through the kitchen, silencing everyone. "I'm sorry, chef," Amani stammered, her voice trembling. "Sorry doesn't fix it," Roland snapped. He grabbed a knife from the counter and pointed it at her, the blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Do you even understand what precision means? If you can't handle it, get out of my kitchen." The room froze. Amani's heart pounded in her chest. But before she could react, Roland stepped closer. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, he grabbed a handful of her tightly coiled hair and snipped off a section with the knife. Gasps filled the room. Amani felt the tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. "Let this be a lesson," Roland spat, dropping the hair onto the floor. "This is my kitchen, my rules. If you can't keep up, you're out." Amani stood there, shaking, as the weight of his actions sank in. The humiliation, the fear, it was too much. She left the kitchen in silence, retreating to the alley behind the restaurant where she finally broke down that night. Amani couldn't sleep. The events of the evening replayed in her mind like a nightmare. For weeks, she had endured Roland's abuse, telling herself it was part of the job, that she needed to prove herself. But this was different. He had crossed a line. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone and dialed her father's number. "Dad?" she said, her voice cracking. I need to tell you something. On the other end of the line, James Carter listened in silence. Amani could hear the restrained fury in his voice when he finally spoke. You're telling me that this man, Roland Pierce, threatened you with a knife and humiliated you in front of everyone? Yes, she whispered. Stay where you are, her father said. I'll handle it. Amani felt a mix of relief and fear. She didn't know what her father planned to do. But she knew one thing for certain. Roland Pierce had no idea who he was messing with. The night was unnervingly quiet after Amani hung up the phone with her father. She stood in the alley, trembling, her breath visible in the cool air. The faint hum of the city seemed distant as she replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over again. She had never felt so exposed, so powerless. But beneath the fear, something else began to stir, a simmering anger. Amani wasn't just angry at Roland. She was angry at herself for enduring his abuse for so long. Angry that her dream of earning respect through hard work had led her to this moment. And angry that, for all her attempts to prove she was just like everyone else, Roland had singled her out in the cruelest way imaginable. When she finally returned to her apartment, she stared at the reflection in the mirror. The uneven patch of her hair where Roland had cut it was stark against the smooth curls around it. She had tried to hold back the tears earlier. But now, in the privacy of her room, she let them fall. This wasn't just about hair. It was about the respect he had stolen. The dignity he had shredded the next day at work. The atmosphere was suffocating. Amani walked into the kitchen to find her coworkers avoiding her gaze. Maria gave her a quick, apologetic glance but said nothing. Even Luis, usually her biggest supporter, kept his distance. The silence was deafening. As the hours dragged on, Amani began to realize the depth of the fear Roland instilled in everyone. He didn't need to shout or make threats. His presence alone was enough to keep people in line. It wasn't just her he had broken. The entire kitchen was a reflection of his control, a place where no one dared to speak out. By mid-shift, Amani felt like a ghost. She moved mechanically through her tasks, her mind numb. The fiery determination that had brought her here in the first place felt like a distant memory toward the end of her shift. As she was cleaning up, Maria approached her. She waited until the other cooks were out of earshot before speaking. I saw what happened last night, Maria whispered, her voice tinged with guilt. I should have said something. Amani looked up, surprised. Why didn't you? Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if Roland might appear at any moment. Because I've seen what happens to people who stand up to him. He makes their lives miserable. And if that doesn't work, he gets rid of them. The words hit Amani like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, to say that silence only gave men like Roland more power. But she couldn't blame Maria. The stakes were different for her coworkers. They didn't have the safety net of wealth and privilege to fall back on. I can't let him get away with this, Amani said, her voice trembling but resolute. Maria's eyes softened. Then be careful. Men like Roland, they don't lose easily. Amani's determination solidified as the days passed. She began to notice things she hadn't before, subtle ways Roland controlled the staff. He would withhold praise from those who deserved it, nitpick the smallest errors, and pit coworkers against each other. His favoritism towards certain employees, particularly the white staff, was glaringly obvious once she started paying attention. One evening, Amani overheard a heated argument between Roland and a dishwasher named Malik. Malik, a quiet man who kept to himself, had accidentally chipped a plate. Roland exploded, shouting insults that went far beyond professional criticism. Maybe if you paid more attention to your work instead of whatever it is you people do, this wouldn't happen. Roland snarled. The words were a slap in the face, not just to Malik, but to Amani as well. She stepped forward instinctively, her heart pounding. That's enough, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The entire kitchen froze. Roland turned to her, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Excuse me? You heard me, Amani said, her voice steadier now. He made a mistake, but that doesn't give you the right to talk to him like that. Roland took a step toward her, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. Who do you think you are? Telling me how to run my kitchen? For a moment, Amani hesitated. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her. But then she remembered the knife, the hair, the humiliation. She refused to back down. I'm someone who knows the difference between leadership and abuse, she said, her voice sharp and clear. Roland's face darkened, but before he could respond, Malik muttered, "She's right." It was a small statement, barely audible, but it was enough. Others began nodding, murmuring their agreement. For the first time, the cracks in Roland's authority were visible. The confrontation didn't come without consequences. Roland doubled down on his cruelty toward Amani, assigning her the most grueling tasks and berating her at every opportunity. But this time, she didn't feel alone. Malik, Maria, and even Luis began standing up for her in small ways, an encouraging word here, an extra hand there. The shift in the kitchen dynamic didn't go unnoticed by Roland. His frustration grew, and his outbursts became more erratic. Amani knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. And it did. One night, after service had ended, Roland cornered her in the pantry. His face was twisted with rage. "I don't know who you think you are," he hissed, "but you don't belong here." Amani met his glare, refusing to look away. "Maybe I don't," she said evenly, "but neither do you." The words were a challenge, and they hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at his feet. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But then he stepped back, his lip curling in disgust. "You'll regret this," he said before storming out that night. As Amani walked home, she felt a strange mix of fear and triumph. She had stood up to Roland, but she knew it wasn't over. He would retaliate, she was sure of it. When she got home, her phone buzzed with a message from Maria. "We're with you." The simple words brought tears to Amani's eyes. She wasn't alone anymore, but she also knew that if she wanted real change, she couldn't fight this battle from within the kitchen. She needed help. Sitting down at her small table, she pulled out her phone and dialed her father's number. "Dad," she said when he answered, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "It's time." The morning after the call to her father, Amani woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She hesitated before answering, still grappling with the decision she had made. She had always prided herself on her independence. But last night, she had reached her breaking point. Her father's calm yet icy voice lingered in her memory. "I'll take care of it." Her phone displayed an unknown number. Reluctantly, she answered. "Miss Carter," a deep, authoritative voice said. "This is Daniel Kane, your father's chief investigator. He's asked me to look into your case personally. I'll need as much information as you can provide about the incidents at La Fleur." The conversation felt surreal. Amani recounted every detail, the constant belittling, the threats, the knife, and the humiliation of her hair being cut. With each word, the weight of what she had endured became heavier. "Thank you, Miss Carter," Daniel said when she finished. "Rest assured, we'll handle this discreetly, but thoroughly. Mr. Carter doesn't tolerate injustice." As the call ended, Amani felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible. Behind the scenes, James Carter moved swiftly, though he was a man of immense power. He carried himself with precision, understanding the delicacy required for such situations. His anger was palpable, but he channeled it into action. "Get me everything on Roland Pierce," he ordered Daniel. "Employment records, past complaints, anything. I want to know exactly who this man is and what kind of kitchen he's running." Within hours, the first pieces of information began to surface. Daniel uncovered whispers of Roland's toxic behavior in his previous jobs, staff members who had quit due to his temper, unaddressed complaints of racial insensitivity, and even a lawsuit that had been quietly settled years ago. But the most damning revelation came from current employees at La Fleur, who were emboldened to speak once they learned someone powerful was listening. Maria and Luis were among the first to come forward, sharing their experiences and corroborating Amani's story. Malik, too, described how Roland's demeaning comments had made him dread coming to work every day. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of the hostile environment Roland had cultivated, and the fear he used to maintain control. Amani wasn't privy to the details of her father's investigation, but she could sense the ripples it created. That evening, when she arrived at work, the atmosphere was different. Roland was unusually quiet, his sharp gaze darting suspiciously around the kitchen. Maria whispered to her during a break, "Something's going on. He's been tense all day." Amani nodded, keeping her composure. Inside, her heart raced. She knew the storm was coming, but she didn't know when or how it would break. The answer came 2 days later. when Roland was summoned to a meeting with the regional manager. It was the first time Amani had seen him look anything other than imperious. His shoulders were stiff, his face pale as he marched into the office. The door closed behind him, but Amani and the other staff couldn't help but exchange glances, their curiosity unspoken yet shared. When Roland finally emerged an hour later, his face was a mask of barely contained fury. He didn't speak to anyone as he grabbed his coat and stormed out of the building later that night. Amani received a call from her father. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of satisfaction. "Roland Pierce has been suspended pending further investigation," James said. "We've uncovered enough to revoke his employment. But I want this to be bigger than a dismissal. Men like him don't learn unless they face real consequences." Amani felt a rush of gratitude and vindication. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. "This isn't just for you," James replied. "This is for every employee who's ever suffered under someone like him. It's time to make an example." With Roland gone, the staff at Le Fleur began to open up in ways Amani hadn't expected. For years, they had operated under a veil of fear, their voices stifled by the oppressive environment Roland had created. But now, a floodgate had opened. Luis shared stories of how Roland would deliberately sabotage employees he didn't like, blaming them for mistakes he orchestrated. Maria revealed how he had once dismissed her innovative dessert ideas, only to present them as his own during a review with management. Malik spoke of the racial slurs he had endured, his voice shaking with emotion as he described the toll it had taken on his self-esteem. Each story deepened Amani's resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about justice for everyone. The investigation culminated in a meeting between James Carter, the legal team, and Roland. The once proud chef was now a shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced by desperation. "You've built your career on intimidation and exploitation," James said coldly. "That ends now." Roland tried to defend himself, his voice rising in indignation. "This is ridiculous. I've given everything to this industry. You can't take that away from me. You gave nothing but fear and cruelty." James retorted, "And yes, I can, and will, take away your license to work in this field." But that's not all. The legal team presented Roland with evidence of his behavior, the testimonies, the records, the pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. As the weight of it all sank in, Roland's defiance crumbled. With Roland officially removed, the atmosphere at Le Fleur began to change. The staff breathed easier, their smiles more genuine. Management brought in a new head chef, a woman named Claire, who prioritized respect and collaboration over fear and control. Claire's arrival marked the beginning of a new era for the restaurant. She encouraged innovation, recognized hard work, and made it clear that discrimination would not be tolerated. For the first time, Amani saw what a healthy work environment could look like, and it was beautiful. Though her father had offered her a leadership role in the company, Amani declined. She wasn't ready to leave the kitchen. Her experiences at Le Fleur had taught her more than she ever expected, not just about cooking, but about resilience, courage, and the power of speaking out. She decided to stay on as a line cook under Claire's mentorship, determined to continue learning and growing. But she also knew she had a responsibility to use her voice to advocate for others. One of the most heartwarming changes came from Malik. With Roland gone, he blossomed, his confidence returning little by little. Claire recognized his potential and promoted him to sous chef, a position he had dreamed of but never believed he could achieve. Amani watched with pride as her co-workers began to thrive, their potential no longer stifled by fear. Though the battle against Roland was over, Amani knew the fight for justice in the restaurant industry was far from finished. She began working with her father to create a foundation dedicated to protecting workers' rights, ensuring that no one else would endure what she and her co-workers had faced. James Carter sat in his sprawling corner office, his fingers steepled as he listened to the report from Daniel King. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing within this room. "Roland Pierce," Daniel began, sliding a thick file across the desk. "A history of complaints and allegations, most of which were swept under the rug. His arrogance has been protected by his talent, but it's clear that talent has come at a steep cost for his staff." James opened the file, his jaw tightening as he read. Amani's voice echoed in his mind, trembling yet firm as she recounted her experiences. This wasn't just a case of one man abusing his position, it was a systemic failure. What about the staff? James asked, his voice low. Will they talk? Daniel nodded. Several are willing to speak. Now that they know you're involved. They've been living in fear for too long. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes hardening. We're going to make sure they're heard. And we're going to make sure Roland Pierce never works in this industry again. While the investigation unfolded, Amani returned to work. The absence of Roland was palpable. The kitchen felt lighter, less oppressive, but an air of uncertainty lingered. Staff whispered among themselves, speculating about his abrupt suspension. Luis approached Amani during a break. His expression conflicted. Do you think he'll come back? Amani shook her head. I don't know, but if he does, we'll be ready. Her words were firm, but inside, she wasn't so sure. Roland's grip on the staff had been tight for years. Even now, with him gone, she could feel the remnants of his control, how fear had silenced so many. Herself included. Maria joined them, her face pale. I heard the regional manager was here yesterday. They're digging into everything. Good, Amani said, surprising even herself with the sharpness in her voice. It's about time. James's team began reaching out to current and former staff, creating a safe environment for them to share their stories. Some were hesitant, their voices quivering as they recounted the abuse they had endured. Others spoke with anger, their long-suppressed frustration spilling over. One former employee, a young woman named Camille, detailed how Roland had sabotaged her career. I was a sous chef, she said, her voice trembling. I had dreams of running my own kitchen someday. But he humiliated me in front of the entire staff. Made me feel like I didn't belong. Eventually, I quit. Another staff member revealed how Roland had used his influence to suppress complaints. He had connections, the man explained. Anytime someone filed a report, it disappeared before it reached corporate. With each testimony, the picture became clearer. Roland wasn't just a tyrant. He was a predator who thrived on fear as the investigation deepened. Amani made a bold decision to reveal her identity to the staff. She gathered Maria, Luis, Malik, and a few others after their shift, her hands trembling as she spoke. There's something you all need to know, she began, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. I'm not just a line cook. My name is Amani Carter. My father owns this restaurant. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Maria was the first to speak. You're James Carter's daughter? Amani nodded. I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to work here like everyone else, to earn my place. But now, I think it's time I use my position to help. Luis crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. So this is why Roland's gone? Partly, Amani admitted, but it's not just about me. It's about all of us. No one deserves to be treated the way he treated us. Malik, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. You're risking a lot, telling us this. I know, Amani said, but if I've learned anything, it's that staying silent only helps people like Roland. I need your support to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just here, but in every kitchen. Slowly, the tension in the room eased. One by one, her co-workers nodded, their initial shock giving way to a sense of solidarity as James's team delved deeper. They uncovered a trail of negligence that went beyond Roland. Certain managers and executives had turned a blind eye to his behavior, prioritizing profits over people. It was a bitter pill for James to swallow. His own company had failed the very people who made it successful. Determined to make things right, James ordered a complete audit of the company's HR practices. He also began drafting a public statement, vowing to address the systemic issues that had allowed Roland's abuse to go unchecked. Meanwhile, Daniel King informed James of a crucial discovery. Roland had been embezzling funds, using the restaurant's resources for personal gain. The revelation added another layer to the case, ensuring that Roland wouldn't just lose his job, he would face criminal charges. The day of reckoning arrived. Roland was summoned to the corporate headquarters, where he was confronted with the full weight of the evidence against him. James Carter sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding and unyielding. Mr. Pierce, James began, his voice cold. Your reign of terror is over. Roland bristled, his arrogance still intact. Terror? I ran a tight kitchen. That's what it takes to succeed in this business. James's expression didn't waver. What it takes is respect, accountability, and leadership, qualities you clearly lack. The legal team presented the evidence, the testimonies, the financial discrepancies, the documented complaints. As the case against him unfolded, Roland's confidence began to crumble. By the end of the meeting, he was a broken man, his career in ruins. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," Roland spat as he stormed out. "And you'll be hearing from the authorities," James replied calmly. With Roland gone, James turned his attention to rebuilding. He appointed Claire, a respected chef known for her collaborative leadership style, as the new head chef at Le Fleur. Her arrival marked a turning point for the staff, who were finally able to breathe freely. Claire wasted no time implementing changes. She established an open-door policy, encouraged innovation, and prioritized the well-being of her team. For the first time, the kitchen felt like a place of possibility rather than oppression. Though Amani was relieved by the changes at Le Fleur, she knew her work wasn't done. She began collaborating with her father to develop a foundation dedicated to workers' rights in the restaurant industry. The foundation aimed to provide legal support, mental health resources, and training programs for employees. One evening, as she reflected on the journey, Malik approached her. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said quietly. "But you did." "Thank you." Amani smiled. "No one should have to go through what we did. If I can help make things better, it's worth it." The ripple effects of the investigation were felt across the company. Other restaurants in the chain began reassessing their leadership and workplace cultures. Inspired by the changes at Le Fleur, Amani's story became a rallying cry for employees everywhere, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged as the weeks turned into months. Amani found herself more at peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. She had discovered her strength, found her voice, and created lasting change. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. The hum of the city outside her apartment was deafening in its indifference. A sharp contrast to the whirlwind inside Amani's mind. The fallout from her phone call with her father began almost immediately, though not in a way she expected. Roland's absence from the kitchen created a vacuum that was felt by everyone. Some staff whispered nervously, wondering if he was on leave or if something bigger was brewing. For Amani, the quiet before action was agonizing. She wanted Roland to face consequences, to understand the pain he had inflicted on her and countless others. But she also feared what might come next. Her resolve was tested when Luis pulled her aside during a shift. "Do you think he knows?" Luis whispered, his brow furrowed. "About the investigation? About you?" Amani hesitated. "I don't know, but even if he does, it doesn't change what needs to happen." Luis's expression was a mix of admiration and worry. "Just watch your back. Men like Roland don't go down quietly." Meanwhile, James Carter's investigator, Daniel King, worked tirelessly to gather evidence. The first interviews with staff painted a damning picture of Roland Pierce. Daniel was methodical, ensuring each story was documented with care. Amani was among the last to give her statement. Sitting across from Daniel in a quiet cafe, she recounted every moment of her time at Le Fleur. "Did he ever apologize after cutting your hair?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but pointed. Amani shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "No, he acted like it never happened. Like it was just another day." Daniel's face hardened. "It's not just abuse, it's psychological manipulation. We've got enough to start building a case." As the pieces fell into place, Daniel uncovered something even more shocking. Roland had a history of misconduct that stretched across multiple restaurants. Former co-workers described eerily similar patterns of behavior: explosive anger, racial insensitivity, and bullying. Yet somehow, he had always managed to move on without facing repercussions. The investigation had barely gained momentum when Roland unexpectedly walked back into the kitchen one afternoon. His presence was like a thunderclap, silencing the staff. Amani's heart dropped. His face was colder than usual, his eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. "Listen up," he barked, his voice cutting through the air. "I've been dealing with some nonsense lately, but don't think for a second that this kitchen runs without me." He directed his glare at Amani, lingering just long enough to make her skin crawl. She gripped the edge of the counter, forcing herself to stand tall. "Back to work," Roland shouted. The kitchen sprang into action, but the tension was palpable. Amani's pulse raced. Had he found out about the investigation? And if so, how far would he go to protect himself that evening? As the kitchen began to close, Amani stayed behind to clean her station. She was bent over a stack of pans when she felt a shadow loom over her. Straightening up, she turned to find Roland standing mere feet away, his expression dark. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice low and menacing. Amani's heart pounded, but she refused to flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb," he snapped, taking a step closer. "I've seen people like you before. You think you can undermine me? Destroy everything I've built?" Amani met his gaze, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "What you've built is a culture of fear and abuse. It's time someone put an end to it." Roland's face twisted with rage. "You think you're brave? You're nothing but a spoiled little girl playing at being a line cook. You don't belong here, and you don't belong in a position of power." Amani shot back. For a moment, she thought he might lash out. But instead, he stormed away, his footsteps echoing in the empty kitchen. Amani let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. The battle lines had been drawn. The next day, Maria and Malik approached Amani during a break. Maria's face was pale, her voice urgent. "We saw him talking to you last night. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Amani said, though her hands still felt unsteady. "But I think he knows about the investigation." Malik's jaw tightened. "If he knows, then we need to act fast. We can't let him intimidate us into silence." Amani looked around the small break room, noticing for the first time how many of her coworkers were quietly nodding. Roland's return had reignited their fear. But it had also sparked something else, a shared determination to end his reign of terror. Over the next few days, more staff came forward to share their experiences. Luis recounted how Roland had sabotaged his dishes to make him look incompetent. Maria spoke about the times Roland had dismissed her ideas, only to claim them as his own. Malik described the racial slurs Roland had muttered under his breath, words that had haunted him for years. Together, they began to realize the power of their collective voices. Daniel King compiled everything into a comprehensive report. A damning portrait of Roland Pierce's behavior. He included testimonies, financial discrepancies, and even documentation of previous complaints that had been buried. The file was delivered to James Carter, who read through it in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is worse than I thought," James said finally, his voice taut with anger. "He's not just a liability, he's a danger." James didn't stop at firing Roland. He contacted legal authorities, ensuring that Roland would face criminal charges for his actions, including embezzlement and workplace harassment. The investigation had grown far beyond LaFleur, exposing cracks in the larger system that had allowed men like Roland to thrive unchecked. The day Roland was officially terminated, James Carter insisted on delivering the news himself. Roland was summoned to the corporate office, where he found James waiting for him, flanked by lawyers and security. "Roland Pierce," James began, his tone icy, "your time in this company is over. You've exploited, manipulated, and abused my employees for far too long." Roland scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado. "This is ridiculous. I'm the reason your restaurants have Michelin stars." James's expression didn't waver. "You're the reason my staff has suffered. And you will be held accountable." As the legal team outlined the charges against him, Roland's arrogance began to crack. By the time they finished, he looked like a man grasping at the last threads of his power. "This isn't over," he hissed as security escorted him out. "Oh, it is," James replied, his voice calm but final. With Roland gone, the kitchen at LaFleur transformed. Under Claire's leadership, the staff began to rebuild, their laughter and camaraderie slowly returning. Amani felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the journey wasn't over. One evening, as she cleaned her station, Malik approached her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing up when no one else could. You're the reason I didn't back down." Amani replied, "We did this together." Amani's father announced sweeping reforms across the restaurant chain, implementing new policies to protect employees and ensure accountability. Amani herself became a key voice in these efforts, working to create a safer, more inclusive industry. The battle had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. Amani had discovered her strength, her voice, and her purpose, and though the scars of the past remained, they were a reminder of what she had overcome, and what she would continue to fight for. The kitchen of LaFleur buzzed with renewed energy. Under Claire's leadership, it felt like an entirely different place. Gone were the days of oppressive silence and sharp words biting through the air. Instead, laughter and music blended with the sound of knives chopping and pans sizzling. For Amani, every shift was a reminder of what they had achieved. Malik, now a sous chef, worked with a quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. Maria's innovative dessert ideas had become a staple on the menu, earning rave reviews from customers. Even Luis, who had always been a steady presence, had begun to experiment with bold new dishes, encouraged by Claire's open-door policy. One evening, as the team wrapped up a busy service, Claire gathered everyone around. "I know it's been a tough few months," she began, her voice warm but firm. "But I want you all to know how proud I am of this team. What we've accomplished together isn't just about food, it's about building a kitchen where everyone belongs." Amani felt a swell of pride. This was the future she had dreamed of. While Le Fleur thrived, Roland's life unraveled. The evidence James Carter's team had compiled was irrefutable, and the legal system moved swiftly. Roland was charged with embezzlement, workplace harassment, and creating a hostile work environment. During the trial, several former and current employees testified against him. Malik spoke with quiet dignity about the racial slurs he had endured. Maria detailed how her ideas had been stolen. Even Amani took the stand, recounting the humiliation of having her hair cut in front of the entire kitchen. Roland's defense crumbled under the weight of their testimonies. For the first time, the man who had ruled with fear found himself powerless. The verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Roland was sentenced to prison, his career in ruins. For Amani, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars he had left behind wouldn't fade easily after the trial. Amani sat with her father in his office. The weight of the past months seemed to hang in the air between them. "I'm proud of you," James said, breaking the silence. "You stood up for yourself and for others in a way that many people wouldn't have. You've made a real difference." Amani looked at her father, her emotions a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "I couldn't have done it without you. But this isn't just about one man, it's about an entire industry." James nodded. "That's why I want you to lead our new foundation. You've shown that you understand what needs to change." Amani hesitated. She had spent so much of her life trying to step out of her father's shadow. But this wasn't about him, it was about using her voice to create lasting change. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But I'm not leaving the kitchen. I still have so much to learn." James smiled. "That's my girl." The Carter Foundation for Workplace Equity was launched with great fanfare. Its mission was clear: to protect the rights of employees in the restaurant industry and beyond. The foundation offered legal support, mental health resources, and training programs for both workers and managers. Amani became the face of the foundation, her story inspiring countless others to come forward with their own experiences. She traveled across the country, speaking at industry events and meeting with restaurant workers from all walks of life. At one such event, a young black woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up to my boss," she said. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not alone." Amani hugged her, feeling a deep sense of purpose. This was why she had fought so hard. Meanwhile, in prison, Roland faced a stark reality. Stripped of his power and influence, he was forced to confront the man he had become. At first, he resisted, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall. But as the days turned into months, something began to shift. One day, Roland received a letter from Malik. It wasn't a letter of forgiveness, it was a letter of truth. Malik described the pain Roland's words had caused, but he also challenged Roland to do better. "You have a chance to change," Malik wrote. "Don't waste it." Roland reread the letter countless times, his mind replaying the moments that had led him here. Slowly, he began to take responsibility for his actions. He attended therapy sessions offered in the prison and even began mentoring younger inmates, sharing lessons from his rise and fall. Though redemption wasn't guaranteed, Roland's journey was a reminder that change was possible. Even for the most broken among us, the impact of Amani's fight extended far beyond Le Fleur. Restaurants across the country began implementing reforms inspired by the Carter Foundation's work. Policies against harassment and discrimination became standard, and training programs emphasized empathy and inclusion. At Le Fleur, the changes were evident in every aspect of the kitchen. Staff turnover decreased, creativity flourished, and the restaurant's reputation soared. Customers raved not only about the food but also about the warmth and camaraderie of the staff. Amani watched it all with quiet pride, knowing that this was just the beginning. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, Amani found herself alone in the kitchen. She looked around at the gleaming counters, the neatly organized spices, and the soft hum of the refrigeration units. This place, once a source of pain, had become a sanctuary. Maria entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said with a smile. "Thanks," Amani said, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee spread through her, a stark contrast to the cold fear she had once felt here. "You know," Maria said, sitting beside her, "you've done something incredible. You didn't just change this kitchen, you changed lives." Amani smiled, her heart full. "We all did," though much had been accomplished. Amani knew there was still work to be done. The restaurant industry was vast, and the fight for justice and equity was far from over. But she was ready. Standing in the doorway of La Fleur, she looked out at the bustling city. The lights glimmered like 1,000 possibilities, each one waiting to be explored. For the first time in a long time, Amani felt at peace. She had faced her fears, fought for what was right, and found her purpose. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning. Years later, the Carter Foundation had become a powerhouse for workplace reform. Amani, still working in kitchens across the country, remained its driving force. Her story was taught in culinary schools as an example of courage and resilience. One day, as she walked through a bustling market, she overheard a young chef talking excitedly about a new dish she had created. The passion in the chef's voice reminded Amani of herself, back when her journey had just begun. She smiled, knowing that the legacy she had helped build would inspire generations to come.